Good evening, everyone. Thank you ever so much for coming out on this cold and windy night. Welcome to Gillingham, the birthplace of Kathleen Courtney. Kathleen is one of the circle of 6 extraordinary women that we have been celebrating over the last year or so as part of our Arts Council funded project. Now, the 6 women, we are recording talks about their lives because, to be perfectly blunt, before this project started, we didn't know anything about them. We had no information about them in our libraries or the archives. And the sole purpose of this is to recognise these women, to give us some information about their lives and work, so that people in the future will have something to start with when they want to start their own projects, engaging with the lively, exciting lives and work of all of these women. Because the work they've done is extraordinary. And I think when you hear about what Kathleen achieved, you'll understand how important it is for us to continue to engage with these women and their work. Their influence is felt. I mean, the 6 women, just a quick run through. Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who was the African princess and friend to Queen Victoria. She lived in Canterbury Street. Kathleen Courtney, the suffragist and peace campaigner. She was born that away, within a few minutes' walk. Verena Holmes, who was the inventor and engineer, her homes and leather company was started in Beresford Road in 1946. Tirzah Garwood, who was the artist, who was born in Railway Street, and Dr. Lorna Wing, the pioneering psychiatrist who coined the phrase, the autistic spectrum. She was born in Gillingham, and she went to school in Chatham. And we've got to talk about her online. Cracking watch. And Rosemary Tonks, who was the literary icon who disappeared. Fantastic woman. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's taken part in our events and activities, because we've had over 2,300 people take part in our events, either online or in person, and that number is only going to continue to grow as we continue on with that. We've had a series of talks like this one, art, science and writing workshops for all ages, and we've got some art workshops coming up soon. We've had some exhibitions, some school author visits. We've got a lovely set of murals just around the corner of Jeffrey Street. They will be taken down at the end of this month, but we will distribute them to somewhere in the local community. Perhaps we'll be putting them into schools. We're not quite sure yet. And of course, we've got the 2 books, a community creative response to the lives and works of these women. There are a lot of adults and children who have written, some perhaps for the first time, in response to the lives and work of these women. And these will be launched in May as part of our celebrations for Local and Community History Month. I'll mention that later. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Shahina Jaffer, who is representing the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Now, this organisation is important because it has a very close connection to Kathleen Courtney. So let me read this out to you because Shahina, she's very impressive. Shahina is a multi-talented artist, social and racial justice campaigner, GLA candidate, and proud member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She is also a TEDx speaker, who has inspired audiences with her talks on the power of art and discusses the power of perception. I've seen that. It's a cracking short video on YouTube. I recommend you watch it. Shahina has actively promoted the suffragist movement and worked to retrace the suffragist footsteps in their 1919 intervention. During the reenactment, Shahina represented Ada Salter, a trailblazing women's rights campaigner and a political figure. Apart from her involvement in social justice causes, Shahina has also worked on peace initiatives with the United Nations. Crikey. Shahina curated an online exhibition called Peace No Nukes with the WILPF to celebrate the UN Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Shahina's artistic talents are also well known. She has used her art to highlight social issues and to inspire change. Her work has been exhibited in galleries all around the world, inspiring critical acclaim for her unique style and thought-provoking pieces. So overall, Shahina is a passionate advocate for social justice, women's rights, and peace. Her tireless work in these areas has made a significant impact, and continues to inspire others to join in her fight for a better and more just world. So Shahina, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sarah, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today to hear about the wonderful work and life of this super inspiring woman called Kathleen Courtney. I've titled this talk From Suffrage to Parliament because I think it really gives us a good idea of Kathleen's journey, the steps she took, and how she not only inspired suffrage, but was influential in Parliament and lobbying. Just a little bit about Kathleen. She was dedicated. She was dedicated to many causes. She's an activist and, you know, a heart and soul, a peaceful person, really believed in the pursuit of peace. She had a good life, and she made some solid, lasting friendships through that life. So when she was studying at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford in 1897, she formed a very lasting and impactful friendship with Maud Royden. And not only was it long-lasting, but it was the kind of friendship that they inspired one another, and they believed in similar things. She was dedicated to campaigning for women's rights. She was an advocate for peace, and that started during the First World War. She also was very much involved in the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. We'll talk a little bit more about what led to her resignation there. As Sarah mentioned, she was one of the core founders of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and then we'll talk also how that came about. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of this absolutely remarkable woman. So her early life was good. I think it actually empowered her throughout her life, really, because she had a good start. So Kathleen was born on the 11th of March, as Sarah mentioned, very closely around here, and she was the daughter of David Charles Courtney. Her father was a senior officer in the Royal Engineers, so she came from that kind of military background. And during her early life, Kathleen, I would say, was curious. She was adventurous. She loved exploring what was around her. She was keen and eager to learn new things. And I would say she had a happy childhood with a supportive family environment. So she was encouraged to pursue her passions. So just a quick snapshot at her education. In the late 1800s, she went to an Anglo-French college in Kensington. Then she went to Mans. Then she went to a boarding school. And then she also spent 6 months learning German in Dresden. And then she went on to higher education, also still continuing learning language, where she enrolled at Lady Margaret and studied modern language. She was awarded a second-class honours. And I mean, this was actually quite remarkable for the time. So we mentioned earlier her friendship and relationship with Maud, and you could see that it was a special friendship, shall we say, and they wrote to each other, and I think these letters and their endearment to one another helped each other pursue some of the things they went on to do in later life. So, Royden's writes letters to Courtney saying things like, with passionate endearment, and she talks about sending her a kiss, and then they talk about missing each other, and this affinity lasted their whole entire lifetime. So again, it was slightly unusual for that time period. So let's recap on her early life. She was born on the 11th of March in 1878. She studied languages. She spent some time in Germany. She had a lifelong friendship with Maud. And she also, after graduating, came back to London, and there in London she worked at a settlement in Lambeth. It was a girls' club where that was I think 1908. But she was driven, she was ambitious, and she knew what she believed in. I think this is one thing that really strikes me all the way about Kathleen, and it's there through everything she does. So after she left London in 1908, she decided that because she came from immense wealth, she could dedicate her life to things she believed in and the causes that she held dear. So she took up a paid post, in fact, for the North England Society for Suffrage. And as Helena Swanwick says, she was a fantastic organizer. And I think that was a quality that was really needed in these kind of organizations. And she had a big reputation for it. So that's what she did in 1908. In 1911, she was elected honorary secretary of the National Union of Women's Suffrage. And again, these are courageous things at this time, you know, for women to do. And then she moved back to London in 1911. She served as honorary secretary for the Suffrage Society, working closely with the formidable Melissa Fawcett, which I think some of you would be aware of. So that was a big year for her, 1911, but so was 1912. So you have to remember that she's doing big things there, but also in that period of time there was a lot going on, and especially for women's suffrage. So in 1912, she became a member of the first election fighting fund committee. And again, these committees were welcoming her because she was a great organizer. But then the First World War broke out, and she found herself at odds with her colleagues within the NUWSS, and especially with the president, Melissa Fawcett, who believed that women should be sort of focusing on relief work and demonstrating that women were deserving of the vote. Now, Kathleen, alongside with some of her other colleagues, took a different viewpoint. And in 1912, Herbert Asquith of the Liberal Party he still refused to support women's suffrage. So, you've got a hostile government not supporting it, and then she's a part of a union that's saying, okay, let's, show that women are deserving of the vote. And I think Kathleen's mindset was there wasn't deserving, it was a right. So if something is your right, you deserve it by just mere existence. So then the Labour Party passed a resolution supporting women's rights to vote. And then Kathleen, alongside her colleague Henry, went along to negotiate with the Labour Party. And in 1912, the NUWSS announced support for the Labour Party candidates by election, and it had already established a fund. So at this point, it was looking fantastic for women. But unfortunately, the war broke out. So when the war broke out in 1914, the government was pressured and was asked to see if they could prevent the war and take drastic measures. However, for Melissa Fawcett, peace was really not an idea. It wasn't a concept. She was really opposed to this, and she was still talking about relief work. The NUWSS took a slightly different stance to the WSPU, who were encouraging men to enlist in the military. So this is a wonderful photo, just to show you the atmosphere and the environment of what it was like. And you can see that even the banner says, law-abiding suffragists. So what were her objections? Well, Melissa Fawcett's objections were, as I mentioned earlier, and also as her biographer says, she stood like a rock in the path, opposing herself with the great weight of her personal popularity. So we have to remember she was popular, and her prestige in the machinery of the Union. So she was just opposed to it. And then actually later on, she talks about peace being like treason. So we could see the level of objection there is. But nowadays she's celebrated, and you can find her on Parliament Square, as I did there. If you look into archives, you can see that she just did not even want women and people talking about peace. And then it's said because she's in talks with Lord Robert Civil, and he had probably said that if these peace talks continue, he would remove his support to suffrage altogether. So that was one organisation, and for Kathleen there was still work to be done, actually more work to be done. And in 1915, she thought that there's still more work to be done, and as did many women. It wasn't just a soloist idea. So in 1915, women all across Europe were fighting for the right to vote and formed the International Women's Suffrage Alliance. And Women's Congress was planned in Berlin, but due to the outbreak of war, it couldn't take place. And Aletta Jacobs organised an individual women's conference in The Hague. Now, originally it was 180 British women who wanted to attend, but due to restrictions and due to many other things, only 24 were granted permission and visas as such. And Kathleen was one of them, along with other very famous suffragists like Emmeline Petherick Lawrence, and 1,300 women from both warring and neutral nations gathered to propose 20 resolutions, including continuous mediation and inclusion of women in all international discussions. Now, Kathleen thinks that discussions is very important to women, and she says that women can and make their own contribution to the work and the ideas of constructive peace. And this is actually something that came about when they thought about those 20 resolutions that they passed in The Hague. And again, I think it's difficult for us to really fully comprehend when we say that talking about peace was really difficult in that period of time. But these women who were pacifists were actually called these dangerous women by Winston Churchill. So they were considered dangerous, which now, if you think about it, it does sound a bit counterintuitive. But that was the political climate at that time. But did that deter the women? No. So in 1915, Kathleen, alongside these other women, they formed the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which still exists today, which I am a part of. So what an absolutely fantastic thing. And take a minute to just have a little read of this, and then let me know what you think, because this is how people wrote about peace at that time, how people spoke about peace. The Women's International Congress does not claim to have invented a new means for preventing war. It does not claim to have put forward any startling or original theory. It does not claim to have been a gathering of women of many countries, which proves that even in times of war, the solidarity of women will hold fast. It does claim to have shown that women of different countries can hold out the hand of friendship to each other, in spite of the hatred and bloodshed under which most international ties seem submerged. It claims to have shown that while women have a special point of view on the subject of war, and while its wastefulness of human life must appeal to them with a particular emphasis, they can at the same time make their own contribution to the work and the ideals of constructive peace towards permanent peace. September 1915. Oh, that's kind of a positive. So does anyone? Yes, please.
I was going to say that most people, you think of the women who were working with the war effort, but also the ones encouraging the men to go off and fight. Probably didn't realise there were women who were just trying to, make it peaceful.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's quite moving, this, isn't it, to see that there were two very different mindsets, and in each way they both had their place. I think both were probably quite needed. Would anyone else like to add a viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really great what they said. Obviously, at the time, the men were forced to go to war, so a lot of them were
conscription, yep.
And I think it's really good that they put those terms of wastefulness of human life. I like that. And I like the fact that they were fighting for that peaceful resolution. But obviously with the disparity, the comparison between the sort of direct action suffragettes and then the suffragists with the peaceful campaign, I think a lot of people at that time probably saw them as one big group, and that's probably where they got the difficulties with Winston Churchill's comments. But yeah, I think it's very moving, and it's a stepping stone towards peace and a resolution.
No, wonderful. Thank you for that feedback. It's true, they were seen as kind of like one homogenous group.
It makes me wonder how much publicity it got at the time in 1915. I suspect not much. No. It's very far-reaching, isn't it?
I think that was part of the reason why they had the suffragist and suffragette pilgrimage that led up to that, where you had that photograph in 1913. It was in June and July, wasn't it, where they had the pilgrimages leading from different cities leading up to try and combat this misrepresentation of what, and particularly the suffragists were keen, weren't they, to have their side of the story. So, well, actually, no, we want this through peaceful means. And I know the ones from Kent walked the old Pilgrim's Way, and they came through Gillingham and Rochester to go up there. So, but I think they did try to counter that idea that all women would be this violent suffragette action. But yeah,
I think that's a good point. Actually, they tried, but there was only so many limited means, and actually, there's a lot of them. They stayed away from protest as well. They found other political avenues to remain peaceful and get their point across. Sorry,
I think they were very brave because they were up against huge amount of propaganda and sort of a overwhelming public opinion and media sort of supporting the war. And then there were sort of very lone voices that were saying the war is wrong.
Yeah, it's true. They were brave, courageous, forward-thinking in many ways.
I often think about mothers post-conflict in various places all around. I'm thinking specifically about Northern Ireland, how they often reach out to each other and try to make the peace, because that seems to be that's what I'm thinking. Yeah,
it's true. I mean, there probably is, I can just think about it as someone at war that is still a son, is still a brother. It's there's still always that personal element. So this statement here kind of alludes to how history will see pacifism, feminist pacifism especially, and it's something that the pamphlets and the 20 resolutions alluded to, that it was radical, militarist viewpoints was a radical thing. And Helen Swanwick writes here, she says, the pacifists would only be successful when they recognize women's claims to freedom. And to a certain degree, we're still looking for that freedom, really. So another big year for Kathleen is in 1916. She took up the role of Joint Secretary for the National Council of Adult Suffrage alongside James Middleton from the Independent Labour Party. Towards the end of the war, she rejoins the NUWSS because previously she had resigned because she didn't agree with their stance alongside other members, but she rejoins and was re-elected to the Executive Committee in 1918, despite her disapproval of the limited franchise being offered to women. And as a result of the new electoral situation, the objective of the women's movement needed to be revised, leading to the formation of the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship. So we're kind of getting there now, and again, Kathleen's there leading the way, and again, she can get herself into chairperson's positions and be on executives, because A, she has the language skills, and on top of that, she's a great organizer. But Kathleen had not forgotten the importance of extending the vote. That was her heart and soul passion, and was an active officer for the National Council of Adult Suffrage in 1917, lobbying for MPs for the extension of the franchise until it was passed in 1918. So we see in her earlier years that she was rooting for the same cause, and she continued to root for it until it was passed. So we've come out with a lot of dates and a lot of achievements, so this is just a quick recap of her early years. In 1911, she was elected Honourable Secretary of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society. In 1912, she became a member of the First Election Fighting Fund. In 1915, she resigned from the NUWS. And then, you know, the formation of WILPF, as it's called in abbreviation, is a big thing. And then I didn't mention 1916. She also went to Salonika and Baxtia to carry out work for the Siberian Relief Fund, and she was later decorated by the Siberian government. So do you see, she's there advocating for peace, and then when she sees the destruction happen by war, she's there helping the people on the ground. Just an absolutely phenomenal person. So in 1919, this was another big year for Kathleen, and she attended the 4th Women's International Congress in Zurich and became involved in the League of Nations Union, and eventually becoming the executive vice chairperson. So there's Kathleen again chairing something. So.
November 1918, the armistice is signed, the fighting has stopped. Millions have died in the worst conflict in history. Millions more are starving under the Allied blockade. January 1919, the victors gathered in Paris to decide the terms of the peace treaty. Meetings went on for months at the Quai d'Orsay. The fighting may have stopped, but the Allied blockade continued, leaving the populations of defeated nations seriously short of food. An international group of anti-war feminists met in neutral Zurich to determine their input to the peace treaty and present their resolutions to those in power. they became the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
My name's Ellen Wilkinson. I've come from Manchester. I didn't get to vote in the last election because I was too young, so I'll be able to vote next time. And I'm here to arbitrate for peace and protest against the Treaty of Versailles.
I'm Councillor Margaret Ashton, and we're going now to be with our sisters in Europe, holding hands across the world to try to stop this sort of carnage ever happening again.
I'm Charlotte Despard. I believe we need to reach out across the nations and make sure that war never happens again, and we need to teach the children peaceful ways.
My name is Mary Church Terrell. I'm here to stand up for all women, equality, peace and justice.
I'm Helen Crawford from Glasgow, and I'm here for the common people and working women of Glasgow and Scotland. We've been campaigning for peace and against imperialism and against war for the last few years. We believe in a different world and a better kind of peace.
They believed the terms of the peace treaty were too punitive towards the defeated nations and should instead aim at building a peaceful Europe.
I'm Anna Robinson. There's a real spirit of revenge around this treaty that they're trying to put together. The men are full of revenge against Germany and Austria, and really we want to put forward another point of view.
Ich sage euch eins, wenn wir so stark sind, dann kommt das Frauenwahlrecht ganz bald.
Ja. Ich habe ja schon 1907 gesagt und eine Broschüre verfasst. Gleiches Recht, Frauenstimmrecht.
Ja. Prima. Und ich bin überzeugt davon, erst wenn die Frauen in den Parlamenten sind, dann werden auch die Gelder gestrichen, die für die Rüstung zum Beispiel ausgegeben werden. Die Frauen werden das doch machen.
Aber wir werden diese Jobs auch kriegen. Und wir werden in den Parlamenten arbeiten und wir werden dann die Mehrheit haben. Wir sind schließlich auch die Mehrheit.
Aber ich glaube, wir gehen noch mal ein bisschen in die Öffentlichkeit.
Ja, wir
wissen, wir wollen das Frauenstimmrecht.
May 2019 marks the centenary of the Zurich Conference. Once again, over 170 women from 22 countries gathered to remember and celebrate the brave women who went before them.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen in the audience, are you ready? Please, let's start the reenactment of the conference of 1919.
So that gives you a little bit more of a sense of how the women were coming together, how their objectives and their motives were all the same. And you could see that even though there was, the war had now come to an end, that passion for peace and equality burnt brightly in their sentiments there. And this is the importance of the work that they carried out there. 100 years later, here we are, now inspired by what they did. So that's us recreating there. And then again, Kathleen, she did some legendary things, especially for that time period. So post-war, she became a pacifist, like a true fighting pacifist. I think she probably always was one, but in the First World War, that's where it began for her. And she went out to help war victims and broken nations. And those people who knew her said that it wasn't just an act of service. In fact, it came from her heart. She was happy. She enjoyed the work she did there. And she went to a lot of nations and as we're saying, this is 1920s. This is, you know, it's not where you hop on a plane or a train. She really had to go through some effort to do this work, but she loved doing it. So she went to the Friends Committee in France, in Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Greece. She was in Vienna for several years, where she was horrified by the post-war scenes of starvation, poverty, and deprivation, really, and she was helping refugees. Now, again, if we think about where we are today, and especially what we read in the news about refugees, how does her work make you feel? Has anyone got any thoughts?
I'm not sure she would be fully in tune with the story idea of refugees.
I mean, that's the thing, when I was doing this research, that's the thing that really struck me, that we're talking over 100 years later, and yet have we moved the dial? So she was a leading figure in the pacifist movement. She was a member of the League of Nations Union, and she became a member of its executive in 1928. She spent much of her time in Geneva, and she worked as the first vice president of the Peace and Disarmament Committee of Women's International Organizations. So, you know, she's involved there, but she's always, you know, chair, vice chair, president. And that takes a lot of dedication. So in the 1920s, the Labour government proposed a bill to extend the protective legislation for women, and many members of the National Union of Societies of Equal Citizenship wanted to change policies to support women's status. And Kathleen stayed in this group and chaired the Family Endowment Council. So a lot of people left that, but Kathleen stayed there and championed it. She also mobilized women in organizations in an attempt to prevent the civil bombing of Abyssinia, which was invaded by Italy. And she was appointed to the executive committee and attended a conference for International Alliance of Women for Suffrage and Equal Citizenship in Paris in 1923 in this capacity. So again, this is 1923, we're not talking Eurostar. And there she was at the forefront. She became the vice president of the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship, as well as advocating for the same voting rights as men. The organization campaigned for equal pay, fairer divorce laws, and an end to the discrimination of women in these professions. So I've just read the word equal pay, and we're talking, this was, 103 years ago. We've not really moved the dial, have we? And then I just want to take a minute to just actually, so you can hear her tone of voice and her thoughts. She was a strong advocate for women's involvement in international affairs and frequently spoke on their behalf at conferences throughout the UK. In addition, she wrote regularly for press on international affairs and traveled extensively throughout the 1930s to lectures in countries such as the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and she was the first vice president of the Peace and Disarmament Committee for the Women's International Organizations. So this is just, if I wanted to go to New Zealand or Australia now, I'd still have to think about it. So just a quick recap there. So in 1923, she attended the conference for the International Alliance for Women's Suffrage, again about equal citizenship. In 1928, she was appointed to the executive in the League of Nations Union. In 1932, she was an observer at a conference on behalf of several women's organizations, again at disarmament. She went on to become the vice president of the NUSEC, and during the Second World War, she worked with the Ministry of Information, particularly in relations to the UK's relations with the United States. So we have to link back to her earlier life. You know, she studied modern languages. So, you know, that makes me think, did she know this is what she was going to do? So I'm sure that German and French came handy in not only Berlin, but Switzerland, where she spent a lot of time. So again, 1930, she's there, a proper figurehead for the pacifist movement, but then she resigns. She resigns from the WILPF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, because she believes that the League's pacifism and the call for complete disarmament was unrealistic. So it's all these years, but then she says, no, it's not going to happen. What does she say about that? This is her own words. I feel strongly that the most important thing at the present moment is to work, if possible, on international lines for the right sort of peace settlement after the war. If I could have done this through the National Union, I need hardly say how infinitely I would have preferred it, and for the sake of doing so, I would gladly have sacrificed a good deal. But the council made it quite clear that they did not wish the union to work that way. So it's a bit sad, really. After all that, she kind of thinks it's unrealistic. But do you think that holds her down? No. And then here we hit the 1940s, and again, she's just there doing absolutely amazing things. So when the United Nations was formed, after the war, she became its deputy chair and was awarded a CBE in 1947. In 1949, she was elected joint chair and joint president of the United Nations Association. In 1951, she retired. But did she really retire? No. So in 1968, she made a speech at Westminster at its 15th anniversary, celebrating the granting of votes for women. In 1972, she was bestowed the UN Peace Medal. And at the age of 80, she goes on a trip to the United States and Canada. And in her 90s, she's still active participant of UNA business. I mean, that's a life. So how would we describe this remarkable woman? We would say that Dame Kathleen Courtney was a no-nonsense individual who valued grace and Victorian courtesies in her dealings with others. Her skills as a chairperson were exceptional, enabling her to swiftly and efficiently resolve issues. Although her composed demeanour may have been perceived as cold, she firmly believed in using mind over heart. Her unwavering dedication to her cause and her ability to meticulously organize made her an unstoppable force. She was strikingly beautiful in her youth and maintained her poise and elegance through her later years. There she is. So again, we can just, because I've put a lot of information there, I'm just going to give you a quick minute just to do a quick recap on some of the highlights. You know, she was a pacifist from the First World War. In 1915, she went to The Hague, they formed WILPF. She was elected chairperson of the British section of WILPF. And she spent time helping war victims, and she served as a justice of peace for various charitable organisations, and she even published, in all of that, she even found the time to publish a book on the history of the suffrage movement. She's next level. So then again, I've mentioned these, but if you just want to take a minute to take on board like these massive achievements. You know, she got a CBE, She was there, very active in the UN. She even when she retired, I mean, she said she retired, but even in her 90s, there she is, you know, waving the flag of the UNA. And then she became a dame in 1952. And on the 7th of December 1974, she passed away. And there was a memorial service held for her on the 11th of April in 1975 in St. Martin's Fields in London. And you know, she maintained her contact. She had friends and people like Maud Royden, Gilbert Murray, and Lord Roberts. Still, I mean, she's there, you know. And Kathleen's work, why is it important today? So I've given my thoughts here, which you can read if you like. But what I'm really interested in are your thoughts. Yes. Why do you think what Kathleen did in that time is so important today? So, I mean, I talk about her work with the marginalised. We still got to do that. I talk about the injustice and the inequality that still persists today. In her writing, she talks about her, I mean, she's shaped contemporary feminist theories here. And she had a dedication to social justice. These weren't what I think by anybody else.
Yeah, because obviously she's majorly important to the history and also to what's happening now. So we've got the Dagenham Workers for Equal Pay, Sex Discrimination Act, we've got all that followed through from all the work that she was doing, and we're still fighting for it. In 2015, Saudi Arabia only just allowed the vote. 2015. Other countries, 1980s, 1972, you know, it's made people stand up and think about women's rights and what we deserve as women. And I think she has, with her and obviously lots of others that followed with her, started a stepping stone of change.
Wonderfully put, thank you. What's your name?
Sam.
Sam, thank you, Sam. So lovelyly articulated. It's a stepping stone of change. And you're right, there's still so much work to do around equalities.
Do you think she'd like the term feminist?
Probably not. I think she probably liked the concept of it, the theory of it, but I think she had her own way of what feminism was to her. And I think a lot, because feminism is so broad and a feminist is so broad, I don't think she would have really signed up to that. Yes?
It was really interesting, thank you. I was really struck by how you said she and the others point at how the settlement after the First World War and the sort of mood of revenge and how that everything was centred that way would have really bad consequences for any kind of hope of peace. And they were right. I mean, and everyone talks about that. You learn that in the history lessons at school, but they don't say that there were women saying this before this came materialised. So that's a really important part of the history that we're not taught, at least not when I went to school, and I don't think a lot of people know that. So quite often, you know, discussions about this sort of radical thinking about peace is often discounted as like too woolly or like that's nice principles, but it's not practical. But actually, that example in there, I know there are many other examples from WILPF's work, I'm sure, that show actually it's not just sort of somehow airy theory, it can be right, and they were right.
And your name is?
Howard.
Thank you, Howard. Yeah, it's a wonderful point. I often think that, why do we see it that way? Peace is always the end of a war. I mean, why can't we just bring it forward a bit? So it's a great point you make there. Thank you, Howard. I would be keen to hear from you.
Me?
Yes, if you feel to add anything.
Sure. I think her work with pacifism is definitely important in today's world. The amount of conflict we're seeing throughout the world, like in Ukraine, Palestine, Syria, Afghanistan, which is only leading to the rising rates of refugees, which also we saw her campaigning for, which is very relevant, you know, the recent works of Suella and Rishi.
Perfect. And your name is?
Sydney.
Sydney, thanks for that. Lovely said. Anybody else got anything? I think I missed.
No, we said something.
Okay.
And I was going to ask, did she come back to Gillingham to live or not?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know. I know that she would have passed through. She had some engagement with the pilgrimage passing through in the 1913. I know she was involved with that, but I'm not sure. But after that, I find it very hard.
So much that
exactly.
She may not have had a permanent home.
The reason I think she might have spent quite a lot more time in London is because they had the service for her. So, but I'm sure, I mean, where you grow up, you always pop back to. So maybe not permanently, but I don't think she would have lost touch. So I just want to show some work of mine, because I'm also an artist. This piece is in dedication to the footsteps we followed, the reenactment of 1919. So I also do a lot of work around Ada Salter. We're actually making a documentary about her. So that's Ada there. And then I've put all the ladies that joined up with her. And I'm going to sign off on this, which is a happy International Women's Day to you all. And one woman can make a difference, but together we can rock the world.
Yeah, excellent. So I just wanted to speak briefly about where Kathleen was born, because it says York Terrace, but York Terrace is now in Marlborough Road. And it's my colleague Katie here who managed to track this down. So she was born on number 1 York Terrace. And we know that this is number 1 because roads were numbered with 1 being the closest to the post office, which was at the time it was in the High Street or Skinner Street. So we know that, and as you can see, that's York Terrace. So when I say Marlborough Road, it is, you could walk out of one of the fire exits at Gillingham Library and you're in Marlborough Road. Take a left and walk for a couple of minutes and there you are. That is where Kathleen was born. So I often, when I found that out, I felt very connected to Kathleen and her work. So yes, so that's what it is. And anyone who lives in Gillingham will be able to tell you where Marlborough Road faces out onto. Do you want to say where it faces out onto? Onto the Great Lines. So the Great Lines, the fortifications, or as we call it, the Field of Fire. It's been used to defend Chatham Dockyard for years, but it was also used for military training and military drills over the years, and it is mentioned in the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. But imagine that we've had, for years, Medway has been a place for the military-industrial complex. And even now, after the closure of the dockyard in 1984, we still have Brompton Barracks, and we still have many military places still being used there. Places that we cannot go because they're Ministry of Defence. They're closed off to the public. So, and also, on a personal note, during the 1980s, I know that the fireworks on Bonfire Night were handled for us on behalf by the military. And one particular occasion that stuck in my mind, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but they had the outline of 2 tanks coming towards each other. I don't know how they managed it. They had some kind of fireworks, shooting fireworks at each other. So that was the space facing Kathleen Courtney as she was born and took her first few breaths. Imagine that field of fire. That is what Kathleen was born into, and that's what she was facing. And despite that, it would have been very easy to get swept up in that kind of militaristic thinking. And despite that, she managed to come to that understanding of humanity, our shared humanity. So that was quite extraordinary. So yes, I mean, I do have a little bit of understanding about how we track down, but that was mostly my friend Katie, so there we go. But I just want to say that as part of this, with funding from the Welcome Back Fund money from the EU, it's the Regional Development Fund, it's part of the Economies Open after the COVID-19, we managed to get a set of wonderful murals that Nicole has prepared. And what we will do as part of this 6 women programme, it's not stopping just because this is the official last talk. I fully intend that we will continue on raising awareness about these 6 women. So those 6 murals, we're going to have them put out into the community, perhaps at the Guildhall, perhaps at schools, but they will be out there so that we can continue to connect with these women. And while we're talking about things that are happening, have any of you heard of the Suffrage Sensory Garden at Rochester Esplanade? Oh my gosh, it's wonderful. It's a sensory garden and it's in tribute to the non-militant suffragist Vera Conway Gordon, who lived in Bowley Hill when she was a teenager. And she very much was involved with the 1913 women's pilgrimage leading up to Hyde Park, the picture of which you saw. So I would say that's definitely worth a visit. And if you'd like information about how to visit, speak to the member of staff here and we will tell you how to get there. But that's definitely worth a visit. So I would just like to offer my traditional thanks. I would like to thank our speaker, Shahina, for doing a wonderful job. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Sam Rapp from Creative Medway for being such an absolute help during this project. Thank you. I would like to thank the staff this evening, Carol, Katie and Henry. Thank you very much, Carol. And I would definitely like to thank Nicole Mollett, who has been, she created those beautiful murals, but she's been such a tremendous support throughout the whole project, going above and beyond. She really has, and she helped us to find some of our speakers, so she really has been an absolute. I'd like to thank the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom for their support. Thank you, peers, for being a rock. And most of all, I would just like to thank you ever so much for coming to support our events, and especially on such a cold and rainy night. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you.